and get rolling. Appreciate everybody coming today. It's good to see a lot of you all again. Most of us were just talking about this on Friday. I'm Matt Wells. I'm the Director of the Department of Conservation Recreation and Chair of the committee. Go around the room.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Steele. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Hi, I'm Sigrid Lampy. I'm the Resilience Policy Advisor for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Good morning or good afternoon, Caitlin Verdue, Resilience Coordinator.
I'm Alex Sams, Chief Deputy of DEQ.
Sean Crumlish, Executive Director, Virginia Resources Authority.
Good afternoon. My name is Madison Teeter. I'm a resilience planner with Arcadis. We are supporting DCR Office of Resilience Planning with the development of the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan.
Afternoon. I'm John Milspaul, also with Arcadis. I'm the project manager supporting the work with the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan.
Matt Dallin, Office of Resilience Planning at DCR, staff to the committee.
Angel Deem, the Department of Transportation's Chief of Policy.
James Hutzler, Virginia Association of Counties.
Bill Curtis, Assistant Director, Department of Housing Community Development.
Greg Kirby, Division of Engineering and Buildings.
I'm Adrienne Catula, Virginia Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission.
Robbie Coates, Director of Grant Management and Recovery at Virginia Department of Emergency Management.
Director for Dam Safety Floodplain Management. So.
Great. Again, appreciate everybody being here today. Just a note, I think for those of you who aren't aware, the city is under another boil water advisory today. So don't use the water fountains. Thanks. We'll go ahead and move on. We've got a packed agenda and 2 hours to get it done in. So we'll move on to the adoption of the agenda. I think everybody's got a copy. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Second.
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Move on to the adoption of the minutes. The minutes were distributed electronically to the group. Does anyone have any changes they need to make to the minutes? Hearing none, can I get a motion to approve the minutes? A second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thanks. Next, we discussed at the last meeting the charter for the group. So we have not made any changes from what was presented to the group. The adoption of the charter allows us to meet virtually and to allow participants to participate virtually under some guidelines. Are there any questions or discussion about the charter? You're not going to get a motion to approve the charter?
So moved.
Get a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we're efficient. So I'm going to turn things over to Greg for an update from the Chief Resilience Officer.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I've met a lot of you, maybe not all of you yet. So for those I haven't met yet, it's nice to meet you. I guess with the boil order, I should mention that I'm hoping I have gut resilience since I had a cup of ramen soup before I was told there was a boil order. So yeah, glad to be here. Been on the ground about 3 weeks now. The full staff's been here, maybe 2 weeks. Working on the status report draft will be due internally in about 3 days. So been appreciating all the support we've gotten from a number of the folks around the table on getting the inputs that we needed to kind of help flesh out that status report for the governor and the General Assembly. And then after that, just a really packed schedule. We're going to be involved in a lot of outreach. Really trying to get out to make sure that we're engaging with the folks in the field where they are versus expecting folks to come here to Richmond. So I anticipate a very busy summer and appreciate everyone kind of bringing us into this moving machine as quickly as possible. I'll mention both, not just myself, but also with Caitlin and Sigrid. We are small, but we are mighty. So looking forward to working with you all as we advance forward. I don't really have a whole lot more to offer on that for an update, but appreciate it.
Great, thank you. Excited to have you and the team on board. So I'll give a quick update on DCR. A lot of you were here for the advisory review committee meeting that we had on Friday to review applications for round 5 of the Flood Preparedness Fund. We got about $64 million in request. The group recommended approving about $45 million in grants and $5 million in loans. So that recommendation will go up to me, to the Chief Resilience Officer, and to Secretary Talon for final decisions. We are looking at pushing out another round of the CFPF this year that will look very similar to the previous round. We did get a couple notes from the Advisory Review Committee that we'll take under consideration. But that draft will be coming out for the 30-day public comment period, hopefully in the next couple weeks. We are also looking at doing a targeted revolving fund, Resilient Virginia revolving fund round, focused on the resilient rebuilding in Southwest Virginia. So again, hopefully to have a draft manual come out in the next couple weeks, also for public comment. So those are my updates. And without any further ado, we'll turn things over to Matt Dallin to get into the meat of
All right.
the meeting.
Thank you, everyone. Can we go? There we go. All right, thank you. Good afternoon. Wanted to provide you all with an update on the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan, and then I'm going to hand it over to our contractors here, Arcadis, to give some more in-depth information and also prepare you for some of the next steps that are going on in the plan itself. So the plan is meant to be an actionable plan for the Commonwealth to really help inform our policies and programs that we do at a state so that we are aligned and moving together to address flooding and the challenges that we face not only today, but into the future. So next slide. This is an overall kind of picture of what we're trying to accomplish with this statewide plan. This plan has not been done in 20 plus years. So it's been a long time coming. So we had the opportunity to kind of re-envision what this meant and kind of come up with a new process. And so what we're looking at is about 20 years out with our vision, goals, and objectives, trying to identify what do we want to achieve and what are we going to do to really get us there through those vision, goals, and objectives. And then from that, in this next 5-year time frame, because this plan is on a 5-year cycle, focusing on strategies that we can work within to help advance our goals and objectives. And within those strategies, having more specific actions within the implementation roadmap. So that is kind of the overall process that we're working through. We started this process in September of last year, and we have a target completion date of December of this calendar year. Next slide. So this is what we're focusing on for our final plan products that we can deliver and release. We will have the plan itself and are still having some discussions on that format, but it will contain all of our content that will outline what our goals, objectives are, the strategies on our implementation roadmap. And it also will include our flood impact summary, which we're going to have a presentation on a little later today. We're also going to have a report in brief, so kind of a short plan document that be presented to decision makers to get a quick understanding of what the plan is and what are we trying to accomplish within these next 5 years. That will also be supported with a data viewer. I mentioned our flood impact analysis. This was a statewide analysis that we've done. It's the first time we've done this level of analysis across the Commonwealth with this robust of a data set. So we have a lot of information to share, and we're going to be putting that into a data viewer. And then moving on beyond the plan and moving into implementation over the next 4 years, we're going to stand up a website to track progress and work with our monitoring and metrics to share and provide outreach to our stakeholders of what are we trying to accomplish and what progress have we made over time, and that will help inform the next planning process. So those are the 4 final products that we're working on releasing by the end of this calendar year. Next slide. This is a little bit of the 5 steps that we've broken the planning process into. Again, I mentioned that we set the stage back in September of last calendar year with our annual flood preparedness coordination meeting. From that, we had a stakeholder workshop and then built off that to define our vision, goals, and objectives for this statewide plan. We've completed that process. We'll go over the vision, goals, and objectives in a couple slides. The next step was to prioritize our gaps to address. So where are we at now kind of did an environmental scan of the different policies and programs within the Commonwealth that address flood resilience and looked at where we're at now, where we want to be with our goals and objectives and defined what those gaps are and worked on prioritizing what those gaps are. The next step that we're working on and just working on finishing right now are the different strategies. So what are the strategies that can help close those gaps and move us towards our different goals and objectives? We're going to present those strategies today. We've gotten 4 or 5 different stakeholder meetings to provide input on those strategies. So we've received a lot of feedback on all of these steps that we've completed for each, for the vision, goals, objectives, and the gaps analysis. We had a virtual feedback session with a very broad range of stakeholders. And then we had an in-person workshop with our core stakeholders to get another level of review before finalizing each element of the plan and moving on. So this is very much a collaborative planning process that we're working on, and that process will continue in the next step, which is the implementation roadmap, which is the final step of this planning process. And that's really to define those actions that we want to take care of in these next few years and really move the ball forward and be working towards these goals and objectives in an aligned collective manner. Next slide. So I mentioned the levels of engagement. We have our planning team, which is DCR, and our contractor, Arcadis. Beyond that, we have our flood committee, which we're here today. Part of the committee's responsibilities is to hear updates, but also to advise on the development of this plan. So we've met previously in February and received some feedback on how to develop the strategies. We talked about how flexible or focused they should be. And so thank you for that previous feedback. And now meeting again today. Beyond the planning team and the flood committee, we have our core stakeholders, which are primarily state agencies. They're largely in charge with implementing a lot of state policy and plans, but also on that core stakeholder list, we have representatives from VACO, VML, and VAPDC to try to get some more of the local perspective, because we know a lot of the state's plans and policies are really also carried out by local governments. I want to be sure that we're understanding what their needs and concerns are as well. Beyond our core stakeholder list is supporting stakeholders. So we've expanded that to include the ag community, economic development community, universities, who else? Environmental NGOs, all the tribes are invited, and really anybody that's interested. That's part of an organization. We're trying to be as inclusive as possible, and this list has been growing throughout the process. The more feedback we hear, and if we hear one organization say, you know, I think this other organization should be included, we reach out and try to include them to make sure we have everybody's perspective heard. And then lastly, the general public of the Commonwealth. We have a public survey that's out right now that we've been soliciting responses on our vision, goals, and objectives and strategies, and trying to understand what the public, beyond providing outreach to the public to let them know what this plan is. Again, this hasn't been a very public plan because it's been kind of sitting on the shelf for 20 years. So trying to raise the awareness that this plan exists, but also to see, get some input from the public on the development and then what we do with it on the implementation. So it's very much a very wide ranging engagement group, and we take this kind of whole community approach that really everybody plays a part to making the Commonwealth more flood resilient. And so we do try to incorporate all the perspectives. And then this statewide plan is meant to both be informed by plans at smaller scale, as well as to inform those plans that are both happening. So our Coastal Resilience Master Plan is scheduled to be updated every 5 years. This plan both informs that regional planning and can inform vice versa, as well as the more local and regional plans that are occurring at the PDC or at locality levels as well. We want to be shining kind of a beacon of where the state wants to go with flood resilience to inform local governments, as well as to get their feedback and see where they want to go. And we know there's kind of some push and pull tension there, but we want to try to see how we can align things as best as possible. So this is kind of our integrated planning process that we've developed through these different stakeholder groups. Next slide. So this is a more detailed view of the schedule of activities. We're here at the Blue Arrow in May of 2025. Hard to believe we've got 6 months until our target delivery. So we know the clock is ticking down, still have a lot of work to do. And we'll get into some more details on the next steps on our finalizing the strategies and then moving into the implementation roadmap, again with the target delivery by the end of this calendar year. Statutorily, delivery is not required until December of 2026, but we are trying to get it out this calendar year. Next slide. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to John Millspaugh from Arcadis to talk about the statewide flood hazard impact analysis.
Paul's there while he's getting set up. Any questions on what Matt just talked through?
I have a quick question, really. It's just more about, is there integration at all between, you had mentioned that there would be a, like a status tracker, and whether or not there's going to be any integration with, I think it's called the CRWE, that's part of the CRMP. Is that a similar platform? Are they going to talk to each other? Or is it going to be an integrated platform or?
Probably not. The Coastal Resilience Web Explorer is much more location based, and we are tracking projects and initiatives that localities want to do. So those are much more place specific actions they want to deal with flooding.
Okay.
At this state level, we're tracking a lot of the policies and actions.
I got you.
So our actions here will not be as place specific as, like, for example, the Norfolk seawall.
Right.
We're not going to have that in the statewide plan.
Okay. No, thank you.
But we do want, where we can, integrate things as best as possible. Appreciate it.
Any other?
All right. Yep. And thank you, Matt. And thank you all for serving on this committee and being contributors to the plan's development. So as Matt said, if you want to keep on the next slide, as part of this work, we performed a flood impact study. This plan is data informed, stakeholder driven, as we've been saying. And so this study was completed to inform the plan's development and next step activities. And with this analysis, excitingly, the site has for the first time has a baseline of flood exposure and impacts across the entire state using common methods, assumptions, and inputs, allowing for comparisons across geographies of the Commonwealth. The results of this analysis serve to complement and augment the existing flood impact understanding in the Commonwealth from existing models at other spatial scales. For example, the Coastal Resilience Master Plan or smaller scales that communities may have of H&H modelings that serve and are relied upon by those communities. This presentation on the flood impact study is not meant to be exhaustive, but is geared to you all to provide some key information on the study's inputs, tools, and types of outputs that will be made available through the study. As Matt mentioned, at the end of the study, the data will be available through an online data viewer to provide access to a lot of the thorough data that was developed as part of this study. Next slide. To familiarize yourself, next slide. Oh, yep, no worries. Familiarize yourself with some of the main data sets that were input into the assessment. Includes hazard data, building inventory, population, critical and environmental assets, and also economic data. To provide some of the data sets that built these data was, first off, the hazards for this assessment are the flood extents and depths of inland and coastal flood layers statewide. So this includes coastal, pluvial, and fluvial flood data sources with multiple return periods and climate scenarios. This is provided by Fathom. We'll get into a little bit more of the details of this in the coming slides of that data set. When it comes to the building inventory, this was developed with a combination of the National Structure Inventory and Lightbox data to provide a comprehensive data set across the Commonwealth. Population data sourced for quantifying human impacts from flooding use 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey developed by the U.S. Census Bureau provided at the census tract level. Regarding the critical and environmental assets, the data for these assets drew on Highfold Secure and various nationwide and statewide assets. The process for developing this was performed with congruence with the inventory that was developed for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And then lastly, the economic data. We used InPlan, which is a proprietary cloud-based economic impact assessment modeling software. It combines data and analytics to calculate direct, indirect, and induced economic impacts arising from a policy change or something you put into the model to track this. And so this is what we used. And this data set draws on annually updated data sets from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. Census Bureau, and the U.S. Department of Agricultural. All right, next slide. That was the nitty gritty, some of the data stuff for you all to track with. If you have questions, feel free to circle back and we can dig into any of it. So in terms of outputs of the study, three main categories: direct physical damages, economic impacts, and exposure counts were the three ways that we looked at things. So in terms of the direct physical damages, FEMA categorized property loss as both structural damage, that is damage that applies to real property or buildings. In terms of contents damage, also looking at the damage to personal property or inventory. And so these losses to the study were evaluated at various flood depths corresponding to the different hazard data, return period, climate scenarios. When discussing the building impacts, you'll see some of this data as we move forward, and that will be available at the conclusion of the project, is looking at across 5 different reporting categories. And so grouped together, we looked at agricultural, commercial, public, industrial, and residential, all being sourced based on the building use when we look at the building direct physical damages. Second, looking at the economic impacts, direct output losses represent economic losses, including wages paid, business income, taxes on production and imports, other property income for buildings directly impacted by flooding. Building direct losses is then input into that in-plan software mentioned to estimate the direct impacts to both employees, taxes, as well as the cascading impacts across the economic indicators, output, employment, taxes. These cascading impacts are the way we are capturing indirect impacts to flood events and tracking the impacts to the flood event, which include business-to-business purchases in the supply chain, as well as induced impacts, which stem from changes in household income spending. Lastly, in terms of those exposure counts, the flood exposure analysis represents a quantitative assessment of people, property, assets, and infrastructure exposed to those three flood sources, flood types: fluvial, pluvial, and coastal flood events. And so in terms of outputs, in terms of exposure counts, these are the counts of people, structures, and assets exposed to flooding, regardless of the flood depth. So it's whether it's exposed or not. It's not looking at how much is it exposed. That's we're looking at those economic and direct damages in those second and third buckets. All right, so now we're circling back to the flood data side itself. So I'm going to get into a little bit of the weeds here. But to support the planning needs for this study, we had some criteria to work with that would make it successful for what we're trying to do with this plan. And so it needed to achieve a few different criteria. First, it needed to cover the entire Commonwealth. We wanted to be statewide. There couldn't be an area that would be left off and having a consistent data set. We needed to have that consistent methodology throughout, that everything would be equally the way that it was presented and done through. We didn't want to stitch together different data sources that maybe were better data here and less data there. Third, it needed to include those 3 flood types: coastal, fluvial, and pluvial. And lastly, fourth, we needed to include projections of the flooding, not just baseline today, but future conditions, looking out into the future, and also being able to look at different climate change scenarios. It was determined that Fathom, a privately owned research-led organization, had data that best met this criteria. So the flood data, hazard data used for this project includes coastal, pluvial, and fluvial data with the annual exceedance probabilities for 2020, which is termed the baseline condition, 2060, and 2100. Along with both the 50% and the 83rd percentile confidence interval for the shared socioeconomic pathway, the SSP 2.5, small in the legend there. So that being that 50% and that SSP 2.5 is termed kind of the intermediate or the middle of the road climate scenario for your reference. On this slide, you can see the different flood types presented across the Commonwealth. This is the baseline or 2020 year event for the 1% annual exceedance probability flood events. And everything on there, as I mentioned, this is the 50% confidence interval for the SSP 2 to 4.5. Return periods from Fathom for the data set that was being used for this study included return periods for 10, 25, 50, 100, and 500-year events. So referring back to our map, you can see various combinations of coastal and pluvial flood drivers contrasted with the western portion where there's less blue there, or gradients there of blue, where there's only pluvial and fluvial out in the western. And so and also you can see here, we have shown some of the data that changes over that baseline. So at the very bottom, you can see the results of the 2020, 2060, and 2100 of that 1%. So 7,750 square miles are inundated in the 2020, and then 8,150 square miles in 2060, and 8,324 as we go all the way to 2100. So you can see that data set growing with the future conditions for the data set. All right, next slide. All right, so then we look at, existing flood information that's available and how does this compare to the data set that was used for this study. So some comparisons being made, one being with FEMA data sets. So you can see here a comparing the 1% annual exceedance probability or the 100-year FEMA floodplain to Fathom's 100-year return period, total flood area. You can see a jump from 2,100 square miles for FEMA compared to Fathom's 7,800. A delta of 5,700 square miles or 270% increase in just land area. And then we look at structures counts as well. You can also see a bump up from FEMA of 119,000 impacted via FEMA's model, and then FEMA's information compared to Fathom being 260,000, 120% increase. So, and both of these gaps are largely to be understood as the additional pluvial data sets that Fathom provides in their data set versus what was demonstrated with FEMA's information. All right, the data set produced is also available at different time scales. We've looked at things at the whole statewide, but things are granular, and we're able to break things down and aggregate data and look at things at smaller scales. And so looking at communities, for instances, comparing both FEMA with the Fathom data, we're showing some of those top communities in terms of the differences between FEMA and the Fathom data sets. So at the top there are the top communities with the largest structure impacts, where FEMA data currently does not identify any structures exposed. These are in the towns of Exmoor, Waverly, Nassau-Wattix, Only, and Hallwood. For these, compared to FEMA's baseline of 0 structures exposed, with Fathom's data set, we have a range of 50 to 147 structures exposed. In the middle area, this is showing the top 5 of percent difference between exposed to FEMA flood data versus Fathom's flood data for those that have some structures that are shown at risk. And so these top 5 are Harrisburg, Cape Charles, Wakefield, Orange, and South Hill, going from 1,700% all the way to 5,900% difference between what FEMA shows of structures exposed compared to Fathom data. Lastly, that bottom tier of 5 communities are the sheer increase of total structures difference between what FEMA data set shows versus Fathom. These are all in the Hampton Roads area, showing the greatest change of all the way from 6,000 in the city of Portsmouth versus all the way up to almost 27,000 in the city of Virginia Beach, and comparing structures that are exposed to just looking at the FEMA data set compared to the Fathom data set. All right, one more slide here looking at some comparisons. So also can continue to drill down to individual community here, looking at only Virginia. So we have FEMA on the left with that data set showing 0 buildings exposed, Fathom 63, Coastal Resilience Master Plan data 76. And so what we can see here, there's a gap between the FEMA data set, the Fathom, and the CRMP, showing that as is with just the FEMA data set, there is a unaccounted for and unmanaged flood risk by just looking at that FEMA data set, largely probably driven from that pluvial data set that is made available through these other data sets looked at, I think, in this community. not a lot of, structures. And so there's that gap there that really this new data set provides for, allows for understanding unmanaged and unaccounted for risk otherwise. Right, some more data, looking at this in a couple different ways across the state. So first off, looking at the land exposure. This is the 1% annual exceedance probability. And looking at this in that bar chart, you can see the 0.2, so all the way to 10%, the 500-year, the 10-year event and going down. These are cumulative. So that first line shows you how much is accounted for in the 10-year, and then it continues to bump up. You include all that to get to the aggregate amount for the 500-year event in terms of statewide land that's exposed for the 1% flood. On the right are the maps with the shades all the way going to yellow to show the increase. And so you can see a high proportion of exposure on the east along the coast with that coastal flood exposure data set. And you can also see over time, it continues to tick up from baseline 2020, 2060, and 2100. Next slide. Another way of looking at the data set by looking at it at the HUG 6 level and seeing actual total land area exposed and seeing what percent of the area is exposed to flooding compared to not. As mentioned in the last slide, the majority of the high land exposure is concentrated in the eastern portion of the state, specifically within the basins that border the Chesapeake Bay or drain into the Atlantic Ocean. And these areas are expected to experience impacts from pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding. And these types of flooding are particularly sensitive to climate change, driven by factors such as sea level rise and shifts in rainfall patterns. Next slide. Another angle of looking at the data is the building exposure. As mentioned previously, different categories of looking at this. The top categories of exposure include industrial, commercial, and public. The way that this analysis was done, we used Go Consequence Loss Analysis software developed by the U.S. Army Corps, which provides direct physical damages exposed buildings to include in its calculations. And the flood damage results highlight the severity of flooding under different probabilities. So this is able to be done with the different return periods and looking at the data between the 1% and the 0.2% or the 100-year and 500-year event. Damage nearly doubles. However, looking at the land exposure, it does not necessarily increase proportionally. So this is what this is telling us is that lower probability, high impact flooding events have more severe consequences for assets and infrastructure. Next slide. Again, another slice of looking at the data in terms of building exposure. In terms of the baseline merged flood exposure, over 0.8 million individuals are exposed in the 1% event. And by 2060, this number is projected to rise, potentially impacting over 1 million individuals during the same event. The highest percentage of population exposed to flooding, both in the baseline 2020 and the 2060 event, include the James, Lower Chesapeake, and the Albemarle Chowan basins. All right, in that third category, looking at population exposure corresponds to the number of people who may face health risks like injuries or stress from flooding. Again, using the 2024 5-year estimates from the Census American Community Survey, population densities at the block level were calculated and distributed to develop areas using densitometric mapping. So looking at the data to then redistribute population where people actually are based on land use information. These densities were then overlaid with the flood extents to determine the total exposed population to the flooding events. As you'll see in coastal communities such as Alexandria, they're in 4, the Buxton 4 area, and Hampton Roads, Buxton 3 area, population density remains concentrated along coastline, increasing that vulnerability to flooding. Similarly, in inland communities such as Roanoke and Richmond, 1 and 2 respectively, there are densely populated areas situated along major rivers, leading also to exposure to flooding, in this case, in both coastal and inland regions. All right, so a couple key takeaways for you all to synthesize some of the data there is that first, FEMA flood hazard data, which does not include rainfall-driven flooding, underestimates flood risk across the Commonwealth, resulting in unaccounted for and unmanaged risks. Second, expanding coastal flooding represents the largest increase in flood risk to the Commonwealth. Third, flood risk is most prevalent in low-lying coastal areas and in the mountains where development occurs near the Commonwealth's water source resources. And fourth, extreme events, those greater than the 100-year return period, such as the 500-year, have the most potential to cause widespread losses.
Right, so we're gonna pause there, for committee discussion. A couple housekeeping things. We've had another individual joining us representing the PDCs today. You didn't know he was showing up. You want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, Ben McFarland. I'm with the Hampton Roads PDC.
Great. Appreciate you pinch hitting today. And then I know we've got some folks online. We will have time for public comment later. If you want to make public comment, I guess just drop something into the chat, to Carolyn, and we'll get you in, at the public comment period. With that, we'll pause. Any discussion from the group or questions on what we just heard? Keep rolling then.
I have one question. So the Fathom analysis obviously took into account flooding outside of the regulatory FEMA floodplain. Do you all have a sense of the amount or percentage above? Because it's a big difference, right? Is that reasonable, I guess, is the high level question. Those numbers, I guess.
Yes. I mean, so that's what we did compare to the Coastal Resilience Master Plan data, to look at that fluvial to see if there was, and they were similar. I think the numbers were like in the 60s versus 70s versus 0. So we're in the same ballpark. We know they're not going to be exact. The Fathom is a coarser data set, so it's probably capturing some locations that may not be as vulnerable to flooding just because of the reduced resolution of the topography than reduced resolution of the flooding. So it's not perfect by any means, but much better. And we think we're in the right ballpark of that level of flood exposure from fluvial. We still have the same caveat with the rainfall driven flooding, especially in the urban areas, that we don't take into account the stormwater infrastructure there, desktop models, that underground piped network is not included in there. But again, where we're at, especially focused at the low return periods, the extreme events, a lot of the systems are overwhelmed and over capacity as is, nor are they always maintained to 100%. So we understand it's not always a complete model of reality, but we think we're much closer and much more comfortable seeing these numbers. And we do think, especially when looking at the FEMA flood claim data, when I think nationally 40% of the claims are outside of the regulatory floodplain, we know that there's a big gap, and this is the kind of the best data set that was readily available given the time frame to help kind of close that gap and help us better understand the challenges with rainfall.
Thank you.
Flooding.
So that leads me to a question, since in our CFPF meeting on Friday, we heard a lot about localities that are facing flooding issues because of their failing stormwater infrastructure. So is anybody working on including that stormwater infrastructure in these tools? Because at least the municipal separate storm sewer system permittees have to map their systems as a part of their permit. So is that step happening anywhere?
So yes, like Virginia Beach has their whole system modeled.
Okay.
Newport News is working on it. I think some up in Alexandria, Fairfax, there's localities in Northern Virginia that are also working on it. So it is a work in progress. It's a big investment to do that, to map it, to know the elevations of all your pipes, what size, and put that into the model. I forget how long it took Virginia Beach, but it was, I don't know, a decade to produce and get it all the way up to where they're at now. So it is a work in progress. We're not trying to have a statewide model that takes that all into account, because that's just, it's feasible, just not realistic. Not in budget.
Yeah, just to, different models for different use cases. The Fathom data and this study is not supposed to replace any and all flood information for communities to use. And so there'll need to be an explanation for what this data is the most helpful for, and also continue to allow people to decide between other data sets, what is the most appropriate depending on what they're trying to do in their community or what scale of a body.
Any other questions or discussion?
Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Madison Teeter. I'm a resilience planner with the Arcadis team. John had the opportunity to talk to you all about the data side of the project, and I have the wonderful opportunity of talking about the policy and program strategy side of the project. So you can go ahead, next slide, Carolyn. So Matt covered earlier that the vision, goals, and objectives of the plan are meant to drive the Commonwealth over the next 20 years. So as Matt was also saying, we had great feedback from all of our stakeholder groups that he went over earlier to get to the point of what I'm about to present to you now of those vision, goals, and objectives. So the plan's vision is a thriving Commonwealth, proactively addressing flood risks to further strengthen the resilience of communities, the economy, and the environment now and into the future. And this funnels down into our goals and objectives. So next slide. I'm not going to read all of our objectives one for one, but they do fall under our three main goals of mitigating current and future flood risks statewide, advancing lasting and unified strategies to address flood risk, and capture additional benefits through flood resilience. So these are wide and broad scoping because we want to ensure, once again, this is the first time that this plan has been updated in over 20 years. So we want to see where all of our policies that are currently, or excuse me, all of our policy and programs that are currently ongoing throughout the state stand and see where we have opportunities to collaborate and maximize those efforts as well as make new ones, really with the mission of striving over these three goals and the objectives that fall underneath them. Next slide. Further into that process that Matt was explaining earlier was looking and identifying those gaps that need to be prioritized over the next 20 years to fulfill across all of the policies and programs that are ongoing at the state level. Not that there's not great work going on in all of y'all's departments and agencies, but just seeing where those current efforts can be maximized and built upon. I'm not going to read all of these gaps individually. I did during our last Flood Resilience Advisory Committee back in February, but these largely are centered around maximizing and filling gaps concerning with capacity, seeing what's hindering collaboration, where we can make more dynamic and flexible decision-making frameworks, as well as things of where we can further provide technical assistance among each other. As we all know that there's a lot of great work happening across the Commonwealth, but how can we make all of those programs talk to each other better so they can build on one another? And also integration of innovative and forward-thinking resilience tools to maximize on the work that's currently going on in the state. Next slide. So before I dive in and present our flood resilience strategies, were there any questions on those gaps, goals, objectives, vision? Great. You can go on to the next slide, Carolyn. So to put into context, we have the part that we're looking at now in the plan is finalizing the draft strategies that will inform the possible actions, is what you see here on the right side of your screen. The possible actions fall under that implementation roadmap section of the plan development that Matt was presenting on earlier. On the left side, what we're focusing on now is the strategies, which are high-level policy and program strategies that we will look into implementing in the plan within the next 5 years. When you'll see in a minute, the language around these strategies are broad and overarching. They're focused on the what. They're aimed at aligning resources and initiatives towards the goals and objectives that I just presented on across all state agencies in Virginia, and also sets the foundation for decision-making and prioritization. The reason why they are broad and overarching is we want to make sure all of the agencies can see themselves within these strategies. We know that flood resilience planning and program implementation can look different between different agencies, so we want to make sure everyone feels like they can buy into these strategies based on the work that they do within their agency. On the right side of the screen here is possible actions, and this is where we start to get into the nitty-gritty of what these strategies will look like on the implementation level within this implementation roadmap that will be included for the next 5 years of the plan. So the characteristics of these possible actions are specific and focused on execution. They can be targeted and customized per agency or within programs of specific agencies. They're focused on the how of achieving the strategy, often short to medium term in nature and measurable, and can be one of many actions supporting the broader strategy. So with that, we'll move on. Not sure what happened to this slide, so you should be
Uh,
clicking for me.
While we're waiting for that to come up, can you just kind of get, I guess,
Absolutely.
we're gonna be putting a lot of information in front of the committee
Mhm.
right now. Can you sort of talk through how we're gonna present this and what they should be thinking about? Because I know we've got some discussion questions at the end.
Of how it will be presented in the final plan document.
Well, just what are,
An agenda for.
yeah, what are we asking? the group
Absolutely.
to think about
So
as we
the
talk
next
about these?
parts that I will be presenting on are all of these strategies fit within these 6 themes, which I will go over in a second. So think about, are these 6 themes and overarching goals, if you will, fit what you think the Commonwealth should focus on over the next 5 years? And then within each of these 6 themes, there will be those strategies. There's about 2 to 3 strategies per theme. So making sure that when I read through those strategies for each theme, if it fits well under that theme, if it's hitting the mark of helping achieve the summaries, which I'll read in a second, that are underneath each of these, and if it seems feasible and it's what the Commonwealth does want to focus on over the next 5 years. Does that answer your question?
Everybody kind of get a sense of where we're headed with the discussion here.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So those 6 themes, I'll go one by one because this is the meat and potatoes of this part of the presentation today. It's meaningful coordination. So we heard from stakeholders that the want and the need for actively increasing awareness and understanding of flood resilience efforts that are happening across various state agencies and programs, and leveraging those existing networks to improve flood resilience outcomes. The second theme is enhanced capacity, which is actively integrating comprehensive staff training and development opportunities with strategic workforce planning to effectively manage and expand flood resilience efforts. Third is resilience funding, which is actively enhancing flood resilience through strategic financial management of existing and potential funding. Fourth is reliable data systems, which is actively acquiring, managing, and sharing flood resilience related data across agencies to inform decision-making and guide policy and program administration. Fifth is proactive adaptation, which is actively implementing flood resilience solutions to enhance financial outcomes, adaptively manage both planning and standards, and prioritize nature-based solutions where appropriate. Lastly is supported local governments, which is actively enhancing partnerships with local, regional, and tribal governments to preserve assets, expand engagement, provide technical assistance, and develop flood resilience resources and guidance. Not sure if it's appropriate to pause here.
Yeah, let's pause here to see
Okay.
if folks have questions or comments or thoughts on the themes.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So I work for the Division of Engineering and Buildings, and so we do building permits, and so buildings and the floodplain is their biggest concern. And the reliable data systems is what we use the most, and VFRES and FEMA for determining the extent of the floodplain. And I was looking at the differences between your different data sources and FEMA not covering as much as the other 2. So is VFRES going to reflect FEMA, or is it going to reflect some of this newer data? And how can we use that to protect state assets?
I believe the updated data is available in the VFRS and so, yeah.
So VFRIS includes the Fathom baseline condition data, the flood extents for the 1% AEP. The FEMA data is still the regulatory data set that is still needed for the NFIP program and all their federal regulations. This data is another data set for people to consider.
So I think to answer your question about the standard, we're working on revising the state floodplain standard. And so which data set gets used is probably something that gets incorporated into that.
Okay, thank you.
But it is there in VFRS for those that want to get to it. Any other questions or discussion? Folks feel like these themes are generally headed in the right direction? Not seeing anybody with frowny faces.
That's good.
Yeah, all right.
Great. So if you go to the next slide, I'll start to get into the strategies that fall under each of the themes. Matt was mentioning earlier that we've gotten a lot of great feedback from stakeholders on all parts of the plan. Just to emphasize how much feedback we got on this specific part of the plan during our last core stakeholder meeting that was also attended by a group of supporting stakeholders, we got 370 comments on these strategies. So we've gotten really great feedback from all of your staff as well as our supporting stakeholders. So it's been really great to get so much involvement from you all. So under the meaningful coordination theme, you can, yeah, Carolyn, we have these two draft strategies, which are coordinate among applicable personnel across state agencies to increase their awareness and responsiveness to flood resilience, as well as leverage coordination bodies and relationships with non-governmental entities in the private sector to advance flood resilience. Not sure if we want to pause after each, or if I should go through all 6 themes.
Do you want to pause, or do we want to give them all of them, and then walk back through?
Yeah, I'll do all of them and then we can walk back through.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, Carolyn, please. Enhance capacity. So under this theme, we also have 2 strategies, which are expand the flood resilience knowledge of state agencies, as well as routinely assess and adapt state agency roles and responsibilities in flood resilience. Following this, we have resilience funding, which we have 2 strategies of optimize existing flood resilience funding resources to accomplish flood resilience goals, as well as explore new financial mechanisms to advance implementation. Following this, we have reliable data systems. We have 2 strategies here of establish a statewide comprehensive flood data management program, as well as establish data-informed decision-making frameworks for prioritizing flood resilience actions. Following that is proactive adaptation. We have 3 strategies, which is invest in effective and innovative flood resilience solutions to improve the Commonwealth's economic well-being, support the deployment and maintenance of nature-based solutions where appropriate, and encourage the incorporation of flood resilience best practices during revisions of plans, policies, regulations, codes, and standards. We're trying to be really inclusive with that one if you can't tell. The last theme of supported local governments has 3 strategies as well of expanded engagement with local, regional, and tribal governments to promote increased understanding of effective flood resilience, provide technical assistance for local, regional, and tribal governments on flood resilience, and then lastly, explore state agency pathways for supporting communities in managed retreat and voluntary relocation. I'll stop there, and those are all the strategies under those 6 themes. Not sure if anyone has any specific questions about one theme, but happy to go back and answer questions about any of them.
Yeah, do we want to, now that we've kind of walked through all of them, Carolyn, do you want to go back to the first?
Yeah.
Kind of take them back through again to see if people have, okay.
Yes, yes.
All right, so we'll pause here. Any questions or discussions on this one?
And we do have specific questions to drive the conversation, if that's helpful, if people don't have specific comments at the moment. Primarily, when thinking about implementing these strategies, as we're moving into that section of the plan, which of these strategies do you all think will be the most difficult to implement? And what do we need to consider with those strategies? Are there other key players that maybe we haven't talked to yet that you know of that we should include in the implementation of those strategies? And then really, as we're moving into creating metrics to track the success of the implementation of these strategies, what level of success metrics can best support the monitoring and adapting of these strategies? So you don't have to answer those questions, but just some to get the wheels turning potentially.
I guess I have an overarching question.
Absolutely.
So the themes, like, I think the second or third word in every one of the themes was actively. So you're actively going to be doing all of these things. And I guess in my mind, like, that means they're happening kind of either on a regular basis or in a sequential way, but somewhere there would be a timeline of things, not, I don't know, over the next 5 years.
Absolutely.
So is there a timeline associated with any of the strategies or like a sequential order?
Yeah, so for the next phase of the project in that 5 bubbles that Matt showed earlier, the next one's the implementation roadmap, and that is exactly what we plan on doing, is when we are getting into the nitty-grittier step of what actions fall under each of these strategies, so which ones are applicable to certain programs or certain agencies, we will outline not necessarily you must do it by this date, but which ones would be more beneficial and effective when implementing them during the first year versus, the 5th year, and which actions can be done tangentially and in collaboration with each other. So yes.
So we should be providing you that feedback today, which ones we think should be
If you have
Right.
comments on that, absolutely, but we will be having our next iteration of workshops where we will be getting direct feedback from staff, from folks of different agencies on those timelines as well. But yes, absolutely, if you have them.
I think we can also send this around to the group to solicit feedback
Sure.
in advance of that as well. So if you're not thinking about it today, give me a minute or two so you can look at these all together. We'll pull the group and collect feedback and then send that back out.
I got one on meaningful coordination, at least from DEQ's perspective. Seems, when I think of like a spaghetti chart of resiliency of people that do and roles and responsibilities, it just seems, like you got the CZM, that's coastal policy driven, you have coastal resiliency master plan, you have state resiliency master plan, you have, just seems like there's too many groups or getting asked for DEQ to participate. It just seems like, yes, meaningful coordination, and yes, we have to be at the table. Yes, we have to do our part, but how do we play in like efficiently and meaningful? At least that's what me and kind of DEQ employees have been thinking about a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think a good portion of the comments that we've been hearing back when we're talking about meaningful coordination and enhanced capacity is that there are programs within all of y'all's agencies that don't currently have the opportunity to talk to each other very much, and they don't know what each other are doing. And so part of the actions that will be underneath this strategy are, that first one is, coordinating across those personnel is just identifying who they are and where you can maximize the work that is being done across all of the groups that exist in DEQ. Because as far as we've heard in our comments, not everybody knows what all the programs in your agency does, and vice versa on the outside. And the number one comment that we get in all of our feedback surveys is the biggest benefit of the meetings that we've been holding is all the agencies learning about what the others are doing and and building those connections of, we didn't even know you were doing that work. How can we work together? So I think that's really the first step of this action. And like you said, with there being so many programs that you all have in there, is creating that awareness.
I'm gonna put Greg on the spot here because part of the reason for this office's existence is to try to help facilitate that coordination. So you want to kind of share any thoughts that you got there?
Yeah, so I was actually chuckling as I was reading it because I was thinking this is a lot of what I'm tasked to do. Although, to be fair and to Alex's chagrin, the recent invite for the IRMT, the Interagency Resilience Management Team, is intended to do what you're talking about, but beyond flooding. So flooding is a very big part, but it's not the only part of the mandate that the CRO office has. So, but the big mandate of it is just that. What are the different agencies doing in the resilience space? What are the authorities they have to work under? Where are their, sometimes it's also where are their constraints, where can't they operate? Because that can also identify areas where you can leverage, support to try to get those abilities. So my hope is, at least from the IRMT standpoint, and also just in the flood space, for our team to kind of help the Commonwealth, through DCR really, on kind of helping with that. And like I said earlier in my comments, when I was first talking about getting out to where people are, I think some of the coordination, and I guess that's getting more at the second bullet, is going down into the field. And there's just so many bodies that are able to do that. And I think the demand signal is very, very strong versus the capacity to respond. So, part of, I think, our job is to try to figure out the best ways to kind of efficiently do that and leverage both in the flood space, but also other hazards as well, to hopefully help get at the meaningful coordination theme that you've identified here.
Yeah, you may be happy to know that probably a fifth of those 370 comments said, shouldn't the CRO do this? So.
Yeah. Right.
Guy.
Right. I said we're lean but mighty, so try.
Yeah, no, we're happy to have you here for sure.
Any other thoughts?
I really feel like there should be something in here about working with political subdivisions. I know that the focus for this plan is on agencies, but there are a number of gaps out there that we've identified in terms of missed opportunities for state agencies to actually leverage work that's going on at the local level, but also impacts to localities from a lack of coordination from state agencies and engagements. So calling that out specifically, I think would be good for both sides here.
Do you think there should be a strategy that lives here, or is that addressed in the supported local
It
governments?
is not addressed right now, and I think it should be under this heading.
Asking to make sure I understand. Any others in this theme?
Is the intent of the second bullet to include like private insurance, I'm assuming?
One more time, I'm sorry.
Insurance company, like in bullet 2?
Yes,
Assuming
but
the
during the,
intent-
for the private sector portion,
That
yeah,
would be- okay,
absolutely.
Okay, just want to check.
So I guess I have a question on this one too. Is this embedded with also the engagement at the federal level? We've been talking about the regulatory requirements of NFIP versus what we're seeing from our different, I guess it ties into the insurance part too, but really, everyone is driven to do what they're required to do. So one of the challenges is if I don't have to have insurance, I'm not going to get insurance. And, there's that nexus with the federal entities on, is that going to be integrated in this at all?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think where you guys are starting to gravitate towards is the action level of specifics of who those coordination bodies are going to be between certain agencies and certain federal agencies. But yes, absolutely, that is the intent under this theme, that those coordination opportunities are where there are federal programs that exist that need to be mentioned with the coordination that's happening among state agencies will be funneled under those actions, yes.
Could we capture kind of Greg and Ben together?
Yep.
In terms of coordinating both up and down by scale when it comes to government?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other comments on this one? Great. Thoughts on this?
A little bit more context on this one. A lot of the feedback that we heard from stakeholders that helped us develop these strategies was there are a lot of staff within y'all's agencies that have different pockets of knowledge of what flood resilience means to them. And when they're trying to make decisions, because they have different pockets of information, they're not always on the same playing field of being able to make those decisions. So what we heard of what the need was is an across the board training or access to information and knowledge to help make those decisions together so that they can be done more collaboratively. And that's really where that first bullet aims to do, whereas the second one is looking at, how can we enhance the capacity within y'all's agencies based on assessing what work is being done where and how those programs can better work together, either in agencies or across them.
So with that second bullet, is that like something, since you'd be looking at actions being like 2 to 3 years, is that something where you would see outcomes that would like require possibly like General Assembly action if it's changes to agency missions or programs, things of that nature?
I don't know if it would necessarily mean agency mission changes, but I could see where there would be General Assembly asks included, depending once these assessments are done and where the agencies stand once implementation of these start.
Going off that remark, it might be good to add authorities to that second bullet.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay.
Resilience funding, I think everybody knows how important money is to getting this work done in agencies. A lot of this is also, we were hearing, wanting to be able to provide financial mechanisms to support localities as well. We know that this work funnels down to our local governments throughout the Commonwealth. And so being able to explore what those new financial mechanisms could look like outside of just our regular grant opportunities and how those could be provided statewide.
Any sort of, James Baco, any sort of, way or, possibility to emphasize, local governments enjoy and rely on the funding, and resource at the local level, but any way to emphasize that this funding should be flexible or, make it a point to have improved flexibility, whether it be resources, funding, technical assistance. Every locality is different, regions are different. So we find that this increased flexibility is
Absolutely. And we heard that comment across the board as well.
cool.
But we appreciate that.
Thoughts on this one?
There really doesn't seem to be anything in here about evaluating the level of funding necessary. And, I think, piggybacking on the last comment that, localities, I know we have funding for some resilience initiatives in the Commonwealth, but I don't think we've really ever done any sort of analysis to say whether that's sufficient.
Mhm.
I don't think so. I think it's a little on the low side. It should be higher, but, our board is certainly waiting on that. But, having an analysis or some sort of work done to evaluate what the level of the Commonwealth's commitment should be to resilience funding, I mean, that could be pulled into this.
Absolutely.
But I think the protect funding from the federal government provides a good model to think about here, because there you could use that discrete funding source for the uplift required to make your asset resilient. So many of us do work that we can continue with a repair or rehabilitation in place. But then to make it significantly more resilient, that's going to require greater investment. So rather than an all-in cost, that's a way you can isolate what resilience is costing for whether it's, in our case, linear transportation or buildings, structure improvements, things like that. I think that's a important facet to think about and caused us to start thinking about how we analyze that delta and then make decisions about where it makes sense to fund the delta and not.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Oh, I think this is gonna be the biggest challenge. You asked earlier what's gonna be
Oh,
the biggest. I think this is the one that's the biggest challenge. I mean, people like to say they're out of Schlitz, but, the need is definitely there.
Reliable data systems. So a lot of, just to go back where these, the impetus of these ones is had to do with where state agencies already don't have working data sets that they already have access to, or if they've built, such as VDOT with their own resilience program. Where can state agencies turn to data sets where they can make collective decisions, or not necessarily use all the same data set, but just being aware of where all those are across all state agencies? And then once we have this data management and sharing program, how can we establish a data-informed decision-making framework that can help make flood resilience actions across all of the agencies talk to each other using that data?
So this one I had a thought on. You had mentioned USACE earlier, and we had talked about the whole up and down comms, but USACE, there's 5 districts in the Commonwealth, and some have done more data acquisition than others when it comes to flooding and flood risk management, things of that nature. And the data sources, the modeling, whatever else they've used, all vary. I understand that. So I guess to me, however, and that's just the USACE example. I know there are other federal entities as well. I think to me, the challenge there is the making sure the data is accurate and comparable across those governmental lines, I guess, because the core studies are always going to be related to usually jurisdictions. But there's a lot of data. I guess the point is there's already a lot of existing data.
Absolutely.
And whether or not that can be used comparatively, I think would be an effort that would be associated with this particular.
Yeah, a lot of the comments that we received back from this one is, we need to be able to use data that we can trust. So creating these frameworks and this management program that will be done, hand in hand across all of your agencies will hopefully build that trust in figuring out which data is already being used in certain agencies, and maybe we can maximize that across different programs, whether it be data that's already, you already using, or the data that comes out of this plan.
Is this meant to also include data acquisition? 'Cause I feel like, given what Matt, you were talking about earlier, with the Fathom data, that the key, we know there are gaps in flood risk information. We also know there's gaps in things like topographic data, stormwater management infrastructure. So having a plan on how to actually go and get the data, identifying the data gaps that are there, and then going and actually acquiring that information should be a key part of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it would help to, I think, make that more explicit.
Yeah, once again, I think a lot of this will hopefully get washed out once we get to the action level for each of these strategies. Once again, a lot of these are more broad sweeping, not that we won't include all of y'all's comments today, but I'm hoping that once we get to that action level, it becomes more clear about what we're asking all of the agencies to focus on over the next 5 years. But all of these comments are great.
Any other comments on this one?
Is this where we discuss perhaps a peer review to validate the data?
I think for sure.
Right.
So proactive adaptation, the themes, or excuse me, the strategies within this theme really have to do with more of where are we wanting the Commonwealth to move into the future as we are implementing various sorts of solutions in this space. So something that was really important to our stakeholders was not only having innovative flood resilience solutions, but also effective ones that we already know work, ones that are tried and true. So implementing those in addition to those new and innovative ones. Everyone brought up nature-based solutions and the importance of implementing those where we can and where they are appropriate for the project site. And then lastly, we know that across state agencies, there are many plans and policies, regulations, codes, and standards that are getting updated, not necessarily all at the same time frame. So how can we maximize when those are getting revised to incorporate the same level of standards and understanding of what our flood resilience best practices are?
Discussion.
I feel like the phrase economic well-being is somewhat limiting. Something like improve the, well, let's see, improve the well-being of the Commonwealth's people, economy, and resources, or something like that. I think would, because it's not just about the economy, right? We're talking about health, safety, and welfare.
Absolutely.
Good suggestion.
I think we can move on to the last. So lastly, supported local governments. This is really where we're tying in the piece of, all of the work that state agencies do can trickle down and benefit localities as well as regional governments and tribal governments across the Commonwealth, to promote that increased knowledge and understanding of what effective flood resilience planning and programming means. Also providing technical assistance to those same entities through various programs that exist across the agencies. And then something that we were told in almost every engagement touch point was starting to think of what state agencies can do to support localities and manage retreat and voluntary relocation planning.
All right. Comments on this one?
Lots of comments.
Okay, go for it, man.
I think I know what you're thinking.
Yeah. Go for it.
I just said we'd love you to take on.
Last one you said?
Change to VDOT will explore.
I feel like it's not very helpful, and kind of a bit of a lightning rod to specifically call out managed retreat and voluntary relocation. This is, a discussion that certainly predates this group that, has gone back, even before all the resilience planning was done in the Commonwealth over the last several years. Something like, effective adaptation. I think that doesn't exclude that possibility, but that doesn't call it out as the preferred strategy, which is why I think this kind of implies to me in seeing this as a regional person that the Commonwealth, that's what they want to, that you all want to help us with. We don't necessarily want your help with that particular strategy. I think that's certainly on the list of things that would be looked at, but there are a number of different potential strategies out there, and localities are going to need the Commonwealth's assistance with all of them. And it's certainly, I think in some places, in some cases, that this strategy will end up coming into play, but to call it out with this much attention at this stage in the game, I think is a little getting put in the cart ahead of the horse.
Okay. So the suggestion is to make this one a little bit broader, less specific.
Yeah, but on the flip side of that, so not in his region, but there is a wastewater treatment plant that was built in the, in the floodplain that at least 4 times has flooded and caused massive environmental contamination. And they keep rebuilding it in the same floodplain and it keeps getting destroyed. So what point do you, it might be wise to spend more money and move that so we don't keep having it.
Yeah, the real impetus of this one is we held a local government specific webinar and we were told by many of those localities that they need state help. They don't know where to start when looking at this. They want help with funding, accessing federal funding, if there can be a state level funding mechanism that can help with this, and any best practices that can be shared at the state agency level that can be shared with localities. So not nearly managing the program for them. And so that's why the word supporting communities is there, is to provide any technical support that localities ask for that need it. Some may not at all, but some who don't have that capacity within their own staff have said that this is an important component for them.
James, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the best way to. It's not that. All right, promoting increased understanding of effective flood resilience is important. I'm not saying it's not, but I feel like local governments, PDCs alike, are the ones on the ground most of the time, implementing flood resiliency, stormwater management projects, things like that. I would highlight the technical assistance more and flexible funding. Again, not to harp on the funding, but look, I think that the staff and the local governments and the boards of supervisors know effective flood resilience. They have professional staff for this. Maybe some of the smaller counties do need the increased technical assistance, and I know they do actually. But
absolutely,
just going, if an agency went to just give a presentation to a board and say, well, these are great things you guys can do in your county.
Yeah.
If the county's budget's $10 million total, how's that really going to help them?
Absolutely.
I think the technical assistance, financial assistance would be highlighted here.
Absolutely.
So I want to return a little bit to the conversation we were having about the third bullet. Is that something that could become more general, and then that kind of, I know we're going to have actions that underlie that. Would it be more appropriate to include managed retreat and voluntary relocation under actions, or do people feel like it needs to stay as a strategy, and perhaps try to split the difference and say it supporting communities and adaptive strategies, including managed retreat and voluntary relocation?
I'm good with including.
People feel better about that?
I'm just a victim of the trauma that I think Ben's referring to with the term in previous lives. So it was definitely a lightning rod comment. It was unpleasant. Alex, you may remember some of that stuff too, but you just don't want it to dictate the conversation to the point that distracts from the purpose of the document is all. So, I'm good either way, because I agree that it is a necessary tool. I just don't know if by limiting to that, you may be doing more harm than good.
But Annette, I like the way you rephrased it. I think it mitigates it From a housing perspective, if I want to kick an anthill, just talk about zoning and planning, okay? Because it's automatically the state agencies coming down to help them, and they don't want the help, they want the money. They have their own strategies, but you still gotta talk about it. You can't ignore it, because it is an issue. It is an obstacle in many cases. So I think you have to have some wording here, but I agree. You don't want to, again, kick the anthill.
Just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, we're siding more on the side of wording saying explore state agency pathways for supporting communities in adaptive solutions, including managed retreat and voluntary relocation.
Do people, well, I guess that, my question for the, I guess for the drafting team is, would that level of specificity be more appropriate as a possible action at that point? It was just a good
I think you
segue
could
into talking
see it-
about the difference between strategies and actions.
I think you could see either way. The reason why these strategies have been elevated to the strategy level is because of the number of times we've heard it from stakeholders within y'all's agency's staff and supporting stakeholders. So I guess for you all is really, do you agree and say that it should be at the strategy level, or is it something that should be brought down to the action level?
Very much like situation specific, right? Like everything has to line up. The local government has to want to do it. Private citizens want to do it. The businesses,
Absolutely.
the infrastructure owner, all that, right? So, I think this is where you could say it, to Ben's point, that's inclusive of that mindset, but not specifically calling out that, because for all the reasons we just discussed.
So I will point out, just kind of flipping through this, I do think this is the only one that has a specific strategy, for lack of a better term, a specific call out like this. The rest of them I think, are a little, a specific outcome or an approch.
The nature-based solutions one maybe is also,
But
the
but
flavor
that's a
is the
whole
same.
wide suite of
Yeah.
of things versus this one. I don't know where that puts the group. We can, I don't know if additional information on what we got from the stakeholders would be helpful in discussing this. We can kind of put a pin in it. I don't know what we needed to.
I think it might be helpful as we move into the next step in the implementation roadmap. When we get these actions, we're gonna see how those kind of group together and what the language is in those actions as well. That can potentially help inform some wordsmithing and kind of alignment of the strategies once we have the actions too.
So why don't we, maybe for the sake of kind of putting something on there, why don't we say explore state agency pathways for supporting communities in adaptive resilience strategies, something, adaptive, something like that. And then we can come back to whether or not we want to call this specific thing out as this kind of evolves. Is that, so we kind of keep it on the table, but.
Absolutely.
That's true.
So this was our last thing. Was there any other comments about the other two? Or I guess the middle, well, you guys all did comments on all three of these, but are there any others?
All right.
So we already got here, but just to remind folks of what our next steps are. We're in the process of finalizing these flood resilience strategies, and we're moving to the implementation roadmap where we'll be outlining those specific actions as well as tracking mechanisms and responsible parties and resources for implementing those actions to guide that implementation timeline that we talked about for the next 5 years. And then the next slide is just reiterating the difference between the strategy level and the action level, because following this slide were those specific questions that I had asked y'all. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I don't know if, now that we've looked at all those in more detail, if there were any more specific responses to these questions that folks wanted to provide.
And so what I'll say is, if people don't have things that come to the top of their head, we can send this out to the group, collect feedback, and then recirculate it around. But if there's something that pops out to you now, floor is open.
And this is our last slide.
I guess to kind of kick the dog, I just, the slide before this, I'll just reinforce that when you look, and I remember seeing it when you were first talking about it, you talked about strategies, it was the what, and the actions were the how.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that ties into what we were just discussing as far as, are we talking about the what or the how? How are we going to accomplish it, or what are we accomplishing?
Absolutely.
Other comments on this or the, yeah, there we go. Discussion question.
Just to kind of wrap this up, in our next stakeholder workshop is scheduled for June 24th. And so we've invited a lot of your staff from your agencies and organizations to participate in that meeting, to come and take a look at the actions that the planning team is going to put forward. We're hoping that we can get the state agency support on some of these actions so that we can actually implement these in the next 5 years. And so just, if you think you need to have any meetings in advance to kind of align your organization on where you think, or you might already have strategies that you're wanting to implement that fall into these categories, and you can bring those to the table or send them to us in advance. Because this is the one kind of big meeting we're doing to come up with these more concrete actions. And again, just look for thank you ones for setting your staff and giving them the time to participate in this planning process. That's critical. But if there's items you want to really support, please kind of be prepared. We're also talking about some kind of read ahead materials as well. So you all and your organization and the staff participating are kind of as aware as what we're expecting out of that workshop, so we can get the most out of it as possible.
Excuse me, I misspoke. It is the 25th.
I guess a couple thoughts on what's on the screen right now. I guess one question, I believe that the joint subcommittee has been on flooding has been reestablished.
I think, yeah.
And so kind of curious if there is an intention or a, plan to engage with them, and how to keep the General Assembly informed. I do think that there's going to have to be some questions certainly about budget issues when it comes to funding, but also about authorities and responsibilities for agencies, tweaks to existing programs, maybe new programs that might be set up. And so I think having a proactive plan to engage with the Assembly in the interest of long-term success, I think would be good. So I'm curious about kind of if that discussion has happened, and when we might start hearing about that. And then I think, for that last point there on success metrics, knowing that this is supposed to be updated once every 5 years, I think it would be really helpful to have something that's much more of a living kind of document, or some sort of tool that can just track what's being done and make people aware of what progress has been made, but also kind of keep a light on things that maybe where there isn't as much progress as we would like to see. I'm not looking for something that would be kind of blaming anyone for a lack of success, but I think having attention on this issue and kind of keep coming back and saying, hey, we thought this was a good idea. At this point, we're not making a lot of progress on it. Why isn't that the case? What can we do to change that? Is it still a priority? These are things that localities that we wrestle with all the time, and I'm sure the agencies also wrestle with all the time. But to have that kind of high level of attention, I think would help to kind of just reinforce that this is meant to be a useful exercise and not just producing documents that, stay on a shelf.
Absolutely. And during the last advisory committee meeting, we talked about, which formats of the implementation roadmap that you all like the best. And the one that people responded most positively to has specific implementation timelines included, as well as where there's overlapping efforts that can be maximized on. So absolutely.
Into the first part of your question, we haven't gotten in any formal communication from the committee. I don't know if it's been named yet. Maybe it has. But I would imagine they're going to be interested in what we're doing. So.
And if you want them to cover it, reach out to the person.
Sure. Yeah, we tend to, at least on the executive branch side, we tend to be reactive to legislative requests versus proactive.
Yeah, the members set the chair, sets the agenda. So.
That was a frequent flyer, the last iteration. All right, other thoughts on this one?
One question, have you actually identified any other examples where states or regions or localities have adopted metrics to measure success in resilience planning and implementation. The South Florida Climate Compact, I know they put out, I think, an annual update on kind of where things are when it comes to the different localities adopting certain policies or practices.
Yeah, there's various levels of detail of metrics that folks have used to track their plans. Resilient New Jersey has theirs. The Texas plan that got released a couple years ago has their own set. So they're all in various levels of detail of what those metrics are, but we do have examples to turn to.
There's actually a virtual meeting of the Pew State Resilience Policy Group next week to talk about resilience metrics. So be interested to hear what other folks have to say there. All right, any other? We'll really appreciate the group's discussion on these strategies. Again, we'll send those questions out for follow-up. We'll now move into member updates. I'm not going to go around the room, but if you have something that you want to share with the group, feel free.
So I think most of you have probably heard us talk or discussion about the NOAA Atlas 15 product. This is the revised precipitation frequency atlas that NOAA is currently working on. We learned earlier this month that NOAA has been directed to pause work on the volume 2 for Atlas 15, which is the forward-looking component. That they're only going to be focusing on Atlas or on volume 1, which is just updating the kind of current precipitation frequency atlas for that. From our perspective, we see both of those tools as being critical for community resilience. Our board at the HRPDC board authorized our chair to send a letter at its meeting earlier this month to the Secretary of Commerce, to the Chief of Staff of NOAA, currently performing the duties of the administrator, I believe, and our congressional delegation as well. I believe the Northern Virginia Regional Commission also sent a letter earlier this week. We think it's a high priority. I think this, another example of some of the changes in policies that are coming out of Washington right now, but that we see that tool as being very essential for our work at the local and regional level, but also for the state. And so just wanted to make you all aware of both of those developments.
Great, thank you. Any other updates from the group?
As you're well aware, the Disaster Assistance Fund, that's sort of all consuming for us right now. And when you mentioned the subcommittee, that sort of sent the hair on my back, standing up, because I know what that means. Even though we manage it, 50 million, of course, split. One's disaster assistance, others mitigation. We're going to get a lot of help. Yeah, that's really what it means. But and that's okay. But it's sort of interesting you mentioned that. And then, of course, Brian Horn, who's the director of Housing and Community Development, stepping down, and Maggie Beal, who's the deputy for Commerce and Trade, is going to be acting his stead. In fact, this is his final week there. So.
Updates?
I guess for those who haven't been a part of the conversation thus far, the commission is starting to look at ways that we can work with DCR to revise the Resilient Virginia Revolving Fund. I know several of you guys in the room were on a call with us last week, and we talked about pulling in localities and PDCs to the conversation as well. So that's certainly something that I'll do in a next step of the process, DHCD as well. So I'll be working on that throughout the summer, and I know you guys are working on your own proposals as well. So.
I guess we are going around there. Robbie, anything you got?
Just continuing to work with Bill's team on lean recovery and board in the Chief Transformation Office. Greg, I don't know if you've connected with Chief Ward, but they're trying to solve that funding puzzle for the specific disaster, right? So it is a challenge with the different federal and state pots of money. So I think this effort and that will be beneficial to learn some of the lessons from that moving forward. That's all I had. Thank you.
Sure, I'll get one. Stormwater update. So 1 July 25 is when it goes final. We had that 1-year implementation timeline. But now, starting 1 July, they no longer have the ability to use old manual, old VRM. They have to use the new guidance that we have. So might be a little bit of, working through that as they can't use the old stuff.
You all right?
No updates.
Eva?
That just continues to work on implementation of our resilience plan. As I'm sure no one can relate to, folks like to talk about resilience and all the data and the strategies and the pilots, but now we're at the point of putting governance together for what you must do and how you must make decisions, and so that's always fun.
Y'all got a road open down on Southwest
We did.
this week, yeah. 58,
Schedule.
ahead of schedule under budget.
Yeah.
Awesome. And for those of you who haven't been down there, if you had seen this road like 2 weeks after the disaster, you'd have thought we'd have been years trying to get it fixed.
No longer there.
Yeah, it's amazing work. Anything else from the department, Matt? Okay. We have reached the time in the agenda for public comment. Is anybody over there, Carolyn? Okay. And for the benefit of the people online, there's no one else in the room. So unless anybody raises their hand in the next 5 seconds online. All right. We'll look at, just again, really appreciate, the group's discussion, today. I thought it was tremendously helpful, for us as we continue to put this thing together. Matt, any next steps you want to talk about in addition to this?
We may have another meeting this calendar year. We have to have at least 2, but we may have a third once we get through the actions and get that implementation roadmap and are further along with the planning process. So please stay tuned. And then just thanks again for allowing your staff to participate in our workshop in June. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. And we are able to meet virtually, at least once, thanks to the policy that you all adopted today. So if we have another one, we may do it, virtually, but again, just want to thank the group, for their work, and look forward to continuing to work with you all. So with that, we are adjourned.
Yeah.